Welcome to the Uncharted podcast. I am your host, Inés Franklin. My hope for you today is that we discover faith beyond the boundaries. Uncharted is intended to be a safe place for you to listen, learn, and challenge yourself along your journey of faith. May grace and peace be with you today. Welcome to the show. Hello, and welcome to Uncharted with Inés Franklin, where we are rediscovering faith beyond the boundaries. Today, I want to introduce you to Kaitlin Elliott. So Kaitlin is a podcaster, and she invited me to be on her podcast a few months back. Her podcast is called, well, I'm going to say it with my own little attitude. So what else? I'm sure she says it differently, but that's her podcast. And if you want to go check it out, you should. But she interviewed me on her podcast when my book came out. And I just so connected with her, and I think she connected with me. We said, oh, we got to do something else together. And so I invited her to be here on the podcast with us. And what a treat it was to have her. What an incredible heart she has. I can't wait for you to get to know her, listen to her podcast, and follow her and hear her story, her testimony. So let me tell you a little bit about her. She has 3 little girls, 7 years old, 4-year-old, and a 7-month-old. So she's a busy mom, and she's running this podcast. She's married to Scott. And I love this on her bio. She gave me this. She said her hobbies include talking, drinking coffee and talking, going out to dinner and talking. So she loves talking. I do too. So we're kindred spirits there. And so does Kayleigh. So the 3 of us had such a good conversation. And Kaitlin shared really from a very deep place where she's at right now. She talks about her grief and the losses that she's had in her life and how what she has learned about God through all of that. So I believe this is going to be a real blessing to you as you listen to it. I hope you'll share it with your friends, especially if there's someone in your life who's in the middle of grieving. I think you will find this to be just a comforting story that will just remind us that we are all children of God, but we are vulnerable to the realities of this world, that we all have the reality of suffering. And we don't compare our sufferings to one another. Pain is pain. But we have a good God who is always the same and who is always with us in all our suffering. So I think you'll see that as Kaitlin shares her story. I hope you'll be encouraged by her. Again, thank you for listening. Let's listen in. Kaitlin, thank you for being with us. We are so excited to have this conversation with you. You're like a professional podcaster. So
please. That's
nice
coming from you.
Come on. And it's so fun to get together with you and hear your story. I've had the privilege of being on your podcast, and it was such a meaningful conversation that we had that I felt like, I want to know about you. And oftentimes when I'm on a podcast and I'm telling a lot about myself, but I want to know about the other person. So I'm super stoked to have you here with me and Kayleigh because we want to know your story, your journey, and what are you up to? So
I'm excited to be here. Thank you so much for asking me. Really, this is such an honor.
Thank you.
Well, I'm coming in because I wasn't on the podcast. Now I get to know you and get to learn more about you. So, Kaitlin, would you tell us a little bit about your journey of faith? Were you a believer young, and kind of just how you have grown along your relationship with God?
Yeah. So, it's crazy because I grew up as a pastor's kid from when I was 5 years old. So when I was in kindergarten, my dad became the pastor of the church that we were already at. And so I always said growing up that I felt like my testimony, was so boring. Like I had testimony envy of those people that are like, I did drugs and I was like, oh my gosh, that's such an amazing story. And mine was like so boring. Like I was just like a 5-year-old. My dad was the pastor, and like that was it. And I grew up in the church, but it's been interesting. Be careful what you wish for, like that I wanted an interesting testimony, because it's been interesting in adulthood. When I was a kid, I got, saved at VBS. I asked Jesus into my heart and whatever. I think that my faith became more real to me personally when I was in high school, college, because, you do things. You go to camps or missions trips,
Yeah.
or you're just with friends, and and you have different experiences where you're forced to kind of reckon with, like, do I really believe this for myself outside of my parents? I feel like college
Mhm.
will for sure do that to you,
Yep.
Yeah.
because you don't have to really fake it anymore. If you're
Yeah.
faking it,
Yeah.
it's like
Totally.
Yeah.
it's either real or it's not for you. And I feel like that was when I really, really made my faith truly my own and did my own, like, exploration into it. And like, I just felt like high school, college, and all of that, and, early marriage, all of that, like, my faith was incredibly real to me. And I had, what I would consider a deep relationship with Jesus. And then, 9 years ago, I think, was the first time that I truly had my faith, like, very much tested. My brother died
Oh
in an
my.
instant, like, so he was my older brother, 3 years older than me, and he struggled with mental illness severely, and, special needs. There was just a lot of things going on. And, a long time ago, this was like, you're thinking this is over 30 years ago when he was born. It wasn't as There wasn't as many resources available,
Yeah.
and it
Right.
wasn't as easy to get help for your child if they were maybe developing differently, and my brother it wasn't like an obvious case, so he would see a
Yeah.
lot of different doctors and things. And I'll save, like, all the details, but essentially, he had Asperger's and very, very, very severe OCD, very severe
Mm.
OCD that impacted his daily life really, really intensely. So as he became an adult, he battled depression and
Yeah.
just a lot of different things. And he wasn't healthy, necessarily, like, but we didn't there was no reason to think he had, like, a health issue. Do you know what I mean? And
Right.
then
Yeah, totally.
Mhm. You couldn't see it.
one night, exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So one night he was just having trouble breathing, and my
Oh
parents
my
called
gosh.
an ambulance, and he died in my father's arms before the
Oh my
ambulance
God.
even arrived. And
Oh my
we
goodness.
found
And you
out
were
later that
there?
I was not there. So that's also
Okay.
part of my
Mm.
story. We found
Yeah.
out later that it was a blood clot, that, so it was a
Oh
massive blood
gosh.
clot. And, my two younger sisters were there, and my parents, but I
Yeah.
wasn't. At the time, I was living in Colorado. I had just gotten
Mm.
married. Scott and I were living out there, and my family's all back in Jersey. So, that was hard because
Yeah.
wasn't there. I immediately got on a plane, flew overnight. I got there in the morning. But by then, like, his body was gone and things like that. But my one sister was very young. She was just a young teenager. She was like 14. And,
Mhm.
she had seen all of this happen. And, you know,
Wow.
it's, and then if a
Trauma.
death occurs in a house that's, like, not just like an old person of natural causes, it's like kind of a crime scene. So then it's like my sisters
Yeah.
had to get interviewed, like, by the police. Like, it was very
Wow.
traumatic for them,
Wow.
obviously.
Yeah.
And, for me not being there, I battled guilt with that.
Mm.
And I feel like that was, like, the first time that my faith really was, like, truly tested. Like,
Yeah.
do I believe this? Because it felt like, here's my family. Like, my dad's a pastor. We're, like, these, like, quote unquote, we're good people. We're, like, very moral, whatever. And, my brother struggled intensely for his 28 years of life. And so many people were praying for him. So
Yeah.
many people were praying for him, that God would deliver him, that they would find, because it was a constant, like, different types of medications, different types of therapies, different types of doctors, and just on and on and on, that they would find something that would work for him, that, and he was really just getting worse and worse. And it felt
Mm.
almost like it it felt like such a slap in the face, almost, to be like, we've been praying for my brother Joe, for God to heal him, for God to bring him relief, and then he just died.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was kind of like, ah. like, like it just kind of felt like, well, what the heck was that? And what was the point of that? Like, what was the point of him suffering for as long as he suffered for it to be like this, and all these people were praying and praying and praying. And like, what is the point of all of that? And for a long time, I never turned my back on God, nothing like that. But I really wrestled with that, like I don't know. I don't know what the point of all of that was, and I don't understand it, and it took me years to kind of come to a place where I felt like I was able to then start picturing my brother in heaven, healed and whole and happy and like fully himself in a way that he was never able to be here on earth, and that brought me a great deal of comfort, to think about Joe like walking around in heaven completely free of all of those horrible things that plagued him, the thoughts, the routines the checking, all the things that he had to do to get through the day. And his life was exhausting because of that, it was exhausting for him to go through those, like for him to even just get, from inside to his car. For me and you, that's like, put on your shoes, grab your keys, go. He, had to check his shoes like a million times and make sure that the laces were tied tight enough. And, and he would untie and retie and untie and retie. And then, the keys. And then he would go out and come back in and go out and go back in, things like that. And so then it felt like, we don't see everything, here on earth. And so for us, we're very earthly minded. And so we're thinking like, God, heal him, like meaning make him like us, right? Like just like kind of like fix him and make him like us. Like where we're just kind of like, sure, like I have like quirks and whatever, but like I'm not deeply suffering from like an intense mental illness. You know what I mean? Totally. So it's like just kind of like make him like us, right? But it's like God is bigger than that and can see bigger than that. And, I believe that Joe is happier than I am now. It's like I'm here on earth still battling earthly things and he's not, like he's totally free of that. He is. And so it's a loss for us because we miss him and we wish that we could have experienced him differently here on earth. So it's a loss for us, but it's not a loss for him. Like Joe like has won, like he's with God, like he's in heaven and it's perfect and there's nothing there, there's no medications and doctors and therapies and things like that.
Yeah. So you explained, thank you for sharing, because that is like massive. And I can understand that would just kind of halt how you process and experience God and even experience, right? Like our concept of heaven and our concept of like what it means to live on this earth. Like having a death like that feels so utterly shocking. And it just kind of resets a lot of things in our brain. And you mentioned that over time, you were able to kind of recognize like, oh, I see him now in a space where he's healed and no longer in pain and he's with God. How long did that process take? And was there anything that happened in that process that like brought you that? Was it a moment God spoke to you or gave you that vision? Was it just a dream? Was it like over time, just consistently? Like how did you get from this like, where are you, God? What even was that to where you felt like, oh, I see him in heaven?
So it's nothing like it's like a semi-boring answer because, like the short answer is like, over time, slowly over time, it just became more real. But God uses things in the process, right? So I remember speaking to someone at one point who was a psychiatrist and because, we were able to watch Joe and his struggle, but like this person explained to me kind of like internally the things that people with like very, exactly. People that are like really struggling with OCD, like what's really going on for them inside. And I remember like hearing it and for the first time really feeling like I knew he struggled, but like his life was like a prison. Like he was trapped in his brain and his thoughts, and he could not break out. And people say things like, people always be like, he's healed now. People sometimes say, and they mean it so well, but like at the beginning, sometimes it like lands a little hard. Like if you lose
Yeah.
someone and people are like, well, he's healed now, like he's happy.
Yeah.
And you're like, thank you. Like
I
it's a
know.
little bit like,
Yeah.
but we wish he was here,
Yeah,
but
totally.
over time, as the shock wears off and you're
Yeah.
able to kind of sit with it, for me, that's something I've really learned about myself is just, I don't tend to have like big moments. Like even when people say to me, like, oh, like when did you like get saved? Or, when did your walk with Jesus like begin? I always say, yeah, I like prayed the prayer when I was however old at VBS. But for me, I feel like my relationship with Jesus was a slow awakening. It was like I slowly started walking with him. And I feel like it's been the same when I've gone through really hard battles like this one, like with Joe. It wasn't like, oh, like I was angry at God and then this thing happened and I wasn't. It was
Yeah.
like I just felt completely, like shocked and like, what was the point of this? Why did this happen? How did God let this happen? And just slowly over time felt like it was just a slow, like God just kind of like quietly whispering slowly over time, revealing more and more slowly over time that he had Joe, and that it was okay now. And like Joe is relieved now. And, I would remember things like on my wedding day. Joe he died 1 year after my wedding. I was able to look back at wedding pictures, and even though I'm glad that he was there and I have him in the family photos, I can look at them and see the great pain that he was in. He was suffering badly at the end. He went through periods of his life where he was doing better, like where the meds were working and the therapies were working and he was doing okay. But the last few years were not okay. And so like at my wedding, I remember that morning there being like, and I was the bride, so people are trying to like shield me from any drama. But I remember there being like a moment like with him and my dad and like he didn't want to get the suit on. Like it was like a thing, you know what I mean? And to look back at the pictures now, I see the pain like in his eyes and how sick he was. And now I really am able to look at that and feel thankful, as weird as that sounds, but to feel thankful that like he didn't have to suffer long after that, and that like God allowed him to get taken home like quickly, not in a lot of pain, and like I believe that he was healed immediately. You know what I mean? Like upon entering heaven, and so but it takes a while, like I don't think that like the day after you lose someone's necessarily ready to like hear that or believe that, It takes a hot minute,
And people
and
they don't want to hear the time will heal. Nobody wants to hear that either.
totally,
Because when you're in
totally.
deep pain, don't tell me that. Don't tell me this is going to be a slow process of healing. I'm dying here. This is so painful. So there all of those is the right term, platitudes. Like we tend to say these things to soothe ourselves. We think we're soothing someone, but we're really soothing ourselves.
Yes.
To kind of wash over what they're dealing with rather than sitting with the lament and the pain and the sorrow. So as I hear you sharing your story, I hear as you were seeing him in heaven whole and well, perhaps also, I wonder if you were also nurturing your wound, nurturing your pain, and having healing come into that. Just because I think you can see someone whole right away, but if you're still deeply in your sorrow, that doesn't matter. You're
Right.
okay, great for them, not so good for me. So there was some growth, and I don't want to say growth in a term like people should grow out of their grief. I'm saying there was some healing, that's a better
Yes.
word, that was
Absolutely.
taking place in you during that season, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. 100%. And Yeah, it was just like a slow, that's something I say to people, all the time. If time does not heal wounds and things like that. It doesn't make it better, whatever. But just over time, like you said, you will find healing in different ways. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then over time, certain things will make sense and certain things won't. And
That's right.
and that's where you have to kind of grapple with, like, are you okay with things that don't make sense?
That's right.
Mm.
That's right.
Because, Ines, as we spoke, what, like a month ago?
Yeah, a
I
month and a
guess for
half
my
maybe.
podcast,
Yeah.
maybe a month and a
Yeah.
half, I was in the middle of stuff with my mom. So I was like crying on our podcast when I talked to you. So,
Yeah.
starting 2.5 years ago, so that happened with my brother 9 years ago. And
Mhm.
it's like funny because we start to kind of believe like things that nobody ever said, right? I kind of then slowly realized that subconsciously I felt like that was our big trauma in
Yes,
life.
I've heard
That was
And now I
say
can
that.
move
Yes.
on. Yeah.
that was my big hardship, right? Like,
Yeah.
People only get one.
and we're good. Yeah, like, so
Yeah.
now at least we're basically unofficially guaranteed that like everything else is going to go pretty good. Like,
Yeah,
sure, there might be
totally.
some like a job loss or like a financial thing or a house thing, but like no one else is going to die basically. Like,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
it felt like we're not going to have any more trauma in this family.
Yeah.
And then 2.5 years ago, my mom got diagnosed with a very rare and aggressive brain cancer. And
Oh.
it was like,
What?
like I was like,
Yeah.
how could this happen to us? Like, how could this happen to us again?
Yeah.
Like, we're not, this is not supposed to happen to us. And then my mindset shifted to, well, maybe like this will be a miracle, like, and
Mm.
it felt like that. So her brain cancer is called a glioblastoma, and most people live about a year. There's
Yeah.
really not, it's incurable. There's really not a lot that can be done. There's clinical trials that have had some success, but it's not really great. But my mom was doing like abnormally well every
Mm.
step of the way. Like, she would have the surgery and she did really well. And then, she did some treatment, she did really well. She did a clinical trial, she did really well. And she had multiple clean brain scans over the course of 2
Mm.
years, to the point where people said to us all the time with a great deal of conviction, like, she has been healed. Like, God
Mm.
told me she's been healed. Like, she is free of this. Like, this is over, like,
Wow.
she is a
Yeah.
miracle. And what's crazy is that, like, I tend to like be a little like shy around that kind of thinking, but I was like like I was like,
Yeah.
yeah, like
Yeah.
she's gonna, like, this is like almost like God owed this to us.
Yeah.
Like, I was kind of like, and I would never say that out loud because I don't think I even consciously knew that I thought that, but I kind of thought like, look, Joe died. Our family's been through enough. Like,
Yeah.
mom's
Yeah.
gonna be like our miracle. Like, this
Yeah.
is like
This
our
isn't
miracle.
reasonable. Yeah.
She's exactly like, she's
Yeah.
healed. Like, she's gonna live for a really long time, and die of like old age later,
Yeah.
and then just this past summer, she started having some symptoms and feeling sick. They thought she was having a recurrence of the brain tumor. She went in to have a surgery and they couldn't perform it because they found a huge mass in her liver. And
Mm.
that was on August 9th. And she died August 27th. We were
Oh my
told that
gosh.
it had nothing to do. The liver cancer had nothing to do with the brain cancer. It was an entirely separate thing, completely unrelated. And there was absolutely nothing that could be done. It was too far gone. And that was it. And Ines, I think when we spoke, I
This
want to say they
before.
had just found the tumor,
Yes.
but they
That's right.
hadn't told us yet. I don't think we had received any pathology yet, and we didn't know what we were dealing with yet. We thought that
That's
it was
right.
like the brain we thought it had metastasized elsewhere. We
Yeah.
thought there was going to be treatment options, and then I found out, I honestly think the day after I talked to you, like, that there was nothing.
Wow.
And that, I mean, I just was like yelling, essentially, like, why has God left us? Like, how could he do this to us again? Like, we had to go through Joe, then we had to go through my mother having brain cancer, us feeling like she beat it, to then she dies of something else. And I said over and over, I said, it feels like God saved her from oncoming traffic to let her get struck by lightning. Like it just,
Mm.
I was like, what is I will never understand what the point of this is. Like, why?
Yeah.
What did we do? Like, what, and it's like, you're
Yeah.
just like crying out to God. Like, I don't have words for this. And something that has really like stuck with me is that one of the days before mom died, the elders from our church came and prayed over her. And one of the elders looked at us and he said, listen, if you guys are feeling angry at God right now, you always grow up and you're allowed to be angry at God. He can handle it, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
In the Psalms, like David is angry, whatever.
Oh my
And
goodness, I've said those things.
no, but
Yeah.
I'm saying you grow up knowing that,
Yeah.
but then when
Yeah.
you're in it, it's not bad. Like, it's like, you grow up and you know that, but then when you're in it, you're just like, it feels like you're going to combust. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And he said, you know what? If you're feeling angry at God, that is not an example of your faith being small. It actually means that your faith is really big because
Amen.
you believe that God could change this. Like, you do believe that God could, with a snap of his fingers, remove all of the cancer from your mom's body. You do believe that. And then she could get up and be fine and live till she's 90 years old. Like, you believe that God could do that. So of course you're going to feel angry when he's not doing it.
Yeah.
And I never heard it like that before. Like, I had always heard it's okay to be angry. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it's okay. Like, you're allowed. But I had never thought, like,
It's
the
actually an
anger is
act of
proof
faith.
of a big faith. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
It's proof of
Yes.
your big faith that you are feeling
Yes.
this way. You know what I mean? That you're
Yes.
feeling like you're going to crawl out of your skin. Like, you're bewildered by, like, why? Like, why would this happen? And why would God allow it? And all, like, it doesn't make any sense to me, because I do believe that we serve a big God and that he could heal her in a minute,
Yeah.
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 And so,
And it's so hard to understand when he doesn't,
mhm,
especially through the trauma that you went through. I remember my neighbor,
mhm,
their son had leukemia when he was
mm,
16. They went through several years of fighting leukemia. He almost died. He made it through. He went
mm.
into remission. They went on a vacation trip together. And on that vacation, he died of drowning.
Oh,
It's like, so
What?
oh,
Yeah.
I
it's
watching
unbelievable.
them go through their journey and the
Oh,
questions that they were asking of God gives me a sense of a picture of the shock that you must have been in through yourself. And
right.
in the sense, like, it makes no sense. This makes no
Yeah.
sense. How can
Yeah.
God allow this? Right? Poof.
Absolutely.
Oh my
Yeah.
Absolutely.
goodness.
And, like, the thing that's so crazy is that it feels like you would turn your back, right? Like, you would just say, look, like, I've had enough of it. Like, obviously
Yeah.
this faith thing isn't working out for me. You know what I mean? Like, well, I'm not getting
And
anything
some
out of
people
this
do.
deal. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. But I found myself just honestly physically incapable of getting there. You know what I mean? That,
Yeah.
like it or not, I still believe that God is real, and I do believe that God is good, and I believe that he's a mystery, and I believe that there are things that he will allow and things that will happen, and we're not going to have, like, a cute answer that's, like, nice and neat in a box and, like, well, this is why, okay? Like, this is why. I heard an interview recently with a woman who struggled for a really, really long time to get pregnant. Really, really long. Finally, she got pregnant. She had a beautiful, flawless pregnancy, and she had a stillbirth, like, out of nowhere for no reason whatsoever.
Oh
And
my
she
goodness.
said in the interview, she said, for a long time, it just felt like, God, what was the point of letting me get pregnant? Like, I would have rather just not, like,
Yeah.
just to, and, like,
That
why
reminds
isn't,
me, doesn't that remind you of the words of Job, who says, I wish I
yeah,
wasn't even born? Like, I was
right.
Yes.
never even formed
100%.
in the womb. Like, you could have erased
Yeah.
me a
Hmm.
long time ago, so I wouldn't have to deal with that. I mean, that makes sense. Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And at the end of the day, like she said in that interview, and she said, and you know what? Over the years since this has happened, I feel like I have some clarity and some answers and some peace, but I'll never have complete,
Full.
just
Yeah.
full peace and acceptance and just like, no, this is great. She said, I'll never until I'm in heaven, And I think that's part of faith, right? So like with this
Yeah.
whole thing with my mom, it's only been a little over a month. So it's like I'm like in
Yeah.
the very, very like the beginnings of
Depths.
this,
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
do I have days where I feel like very dark and very hopeless? Absolutely. And then I have days where I feel like God brings me some form of encouragement or clarity. I've actually spoken to a lot of people since she died who had somebody that they knew, a loved one, who did die of the brain cancer that my mom had.
Mhm.
And they have told me time and time again all these different stories that death, dying of a glioblastoma, is gruesome, more
Oh.
so than what my mom went through with the liver. Even though the liver was shocking, it was very quick. She didn't go through a lot of intense physical pain.
Yeah.
She didn't suffer long. And, people have said to me, like, I don't know if you're ready to hear this, but, you know, it was better for her. Like, it was better
Wow.
for her. And so, look, am I in a place where I'm like, oh, okay, so thanks, God.
Yeah.
Thank you for the liver cancer? Like, no.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
am I able to tiptoe into thinking, like, God, again, like I said about Joe, God sees more than we can see. When
Yeah.
she
Yeah.
had the brain cancer, we were just like, heal her of this, heal her of this, heal her of this. You know what I mean? And that's all. And all we're thinking is just like, let her just like walk around like a normal person,
Yeah.
And it's like he can see bigger and more and all of that, And at some point, I think it's natural as humans to like grasp for answers and want like a this is why, this is how, this is, and I do think we have to arrive at a place where we are willing to have slow, healing and slow awakening over time, and also know that like this is earth and we're not going to fully know until we're in heaven one day.
Yeah. I think that it's easy to look at your trauma and then assume that if they have experienced a different trauma, that it's not as big, that it's not worthy to be grieved in the
Mhm.
same way.
Mhm.
And I just want to really look at the bigger picture to what we're talking about in this space, which is that grief doesn't have a simple answer as to why. The
Mhm.
experience that we go through in life that is a Job season or a painful season
Mhm.
doesn't always have a why. Sometimes that why is seen and known by God, and that's it.
Yeah.
And I think also sometimes it's just this experience that's um it's actually for his glory, as painful as that is.
Mhm.
I have 5 autoimmune diseases. And
Mm.
so I was diagnosed when I was 22 years old. I was a super active, super fit, thin little thing. And then
Mhm.
I got hit with chronic pain
Mm.
and was basically bedridden and have been bedridden multiple times over my life.
Mm.
And there was actually a point that he healed me and I was in no pain, and I was afraid to tell anybody because I was
Mhm.
afraid, well, what if it comes back? Or what if this is
Mhm.
just some random thing and it has nothing to do with God? And I
Mhm.
finally started telling people, and it was about a year that I was pain free. And then it just started coming back.
Mm.
And I did the same, not wisely, I did the same thing in the opposite, which is as the pain started to return, I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to tell people
Mm.
that I was struggling in pain. And it was really only in the past few months that I've gone and spoken to my doctors and said, hey, I'm not okay. Like, I'm
Mhm.
not where I've been, but I'm not okay. Something's up and I need to get help.
Mm.
And they were so quick to be like, yeah, 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 here, check, 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 check. And they like are on it, but it's
Mhm.
just so
Mhm.
interesting because there's parts of me that says, yeah, okay, I experience severe chronic pain and have to go through all of these things because it gives me empathy and understanding for people who
Mhm.
deal with mental health or medical
Yeah.
problems. I am able to walk people along that journey, how to intersect faith and chronic pain, or faith
Yeah.
and medicine. What does that walk through? So there's a part of me that has this why, this
Mhm.
answer, but there's a bigger part of me that's like, well, why couldn't we have healed me? I still could have done all of that without
Totally.
continuing to have pain. I
Mhm.
still could have experienced it and moved on. And yet
Yeah.
here I am back at the beginning of where I have been.
Mm.
And I think it's just this reminder that we all have things. Everyone's going to hold things. Everyone's going to experience things. And it may seem big and it may seem small to the external world. But what
Mhm.
you have to go through and what you're experiencing is wholly worth grieving and wholly
Mhm.
worth explaining and processing through, and
Mhm.
realizing that in that grief there may never be a why, but God is still good. God is
Mhm.
still with us. God will
Mhm.
still guide us, and he knows what's going on.
Mhm.
But at the
Absolutely.
same time, I have a friend who had trauma after trauma after trauma. Daughter had cancer.
Mm.
Mother had cancer. All these different things were
Yeah.
coming up in her life. And she actually ended up with a form of PTSD where she had this fear
Mhm.
of what's that next phone call going
Yeah.
to say to me?
Totally.
What's the next thing that's going to come at me? And it's not, one kind of grief is looking back at what we have
Mhm.
experienced, but another grief is having a fear for what the future is going to bring. Like, okay,
Mhm.
now
Totally.
I know I'm
It's
not in
good.
control.
Yeah.
Anything can happen to me.
Mm.
Clearly, God is God and I'm not. So that
Mhm.
means anything can happen and
Mhm.
God may allow it to happen. So then how do I function now without a fear of the
Mhm.
future? So I remember
Mhm.
my
Yeah.
friend being very, very, really struggling with that sort of
Yeah.
place. And, Kaitlin, you're fairly early in your journey of
Yeah.
grieving with your mom.
Mhm.
I wonder if is there a part of your heart that's sort of dealing with a little bit of that at all? Of kind of like,
Oh,
oh my goodness, this now has happened to me twice. Two big
yes.
things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, that hits home for me 100% because, like I said, I think that after Joe, I really was living in that like weird, false, subconscious sense of like, we're going to be good because we went through this
Yeah.
one. This is our thing. This will be our
Yeah.
story. Like, this was our hard thing that we had to go through, and now that we've just experienced this and like we're still dealing with the shock from mom, right? Because even though
Yeah.
she was sick, meaning she had the brain cancer, she had been doing so well for so long. She had just spoken in June at a summit because she was like this like encouraging symbol of like how doing so well, and
Yeah.
she died 2 months after that from something else. Like, it just still
Yeah.
feels very, very shocking, and it is scary. It feels like,
Yeah.
what's the next thing? What
Yeah.
something this obviously okay, so then obviously we're not, home free where it's like, okay, you do one hard thing and then you move on. Like,
Yeah.
obviously we're not, quote unquote safe, And so yeah, it is scary. I recently read a quote by Tim Keller. He said, the gospel does not promise us better life circumstances. It promises us a better life.
Mm.
Mhm.
And it's like, and Tim Keller died of cancer.
Right.
It's like it's like this is somebody who like, and so like he suffered obviously, but I think it's very easy to subconsciously think that God promises us better life circumstances. You just like kind
Yeah.
of subconsciously think that, like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
like we're faithful, we believe in him, we're praying, so it's like our circumstances should be better.
Yeah.
But like he doesn't say that that's going to be what it's going to be. And like this is earth, and
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
just like and to your point, Kayleigh, earlier about, if somebody thinks like, oh, well, my trauma's not as bad, whatever. I just interviewed someone this week who said, it's not the hardship Olympics. And I was
Yeah.
like, I love that. I was like, I'm stealing that and I'm going to use that because you're right. It's so easy. Because when I was interviewing her, I was like, oh my gosh, like her mom died of the same thing, but faster. And I was like, your story's even worse
Mm.
than mine. And she was like,
Yeah.
no, it's all bad. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it's all
Yeah.
bad. Like it's
Yeah.
suffering is
Pain is pain.
suffering. Yeah, you know what I mean? And so exactly like what you said, you grief looks different for everyone. Not every situation is the same, different battles, all the things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's not
Well,
easy.
and
None of it's
no, and
easy.
they all go to
Yeah.
prove that we are vulnerable
Mhm.
people. We're
Yeah.
Yeah.
vulnerable creatures created by
Mhm.
a perfect God.
Yeah.
And we don't like that. I don't like that. I don't like the feeling of
Mhm.
how vulnerable and how delicate life could be, how it can
Of
change in an
course.
instant. Like you're going along and we don't know what tomorrow holds. And that's why we all become somewhat control freaks and we crave for control, for certainty, because
Mhm.
it feels so vulnerable.
Mhm.
And that's an uncomfortable feeling. And
Totally.
yet I think what I'm sure, Kaitlin, you would echo this. I just judging by the way you are sharing that God's faithfulness has been a constant in your life when you were a
Mhm.
5-year-old, when you were in middle school, when you went to high school and you switched things.
Mhm.
Like he was faithful there when Joe passed away.
Mhm.
He is faithful now. Like that presence of God, that is the promise God gives.
Mhm.
That's the
Mhm.
certainty God does commit to us, that
Mhm.
we can count on his presence no matter what,
Mhm.
and that he will provide for us what we need in that moment. So
Mhm.
I don't know what tomorrow can hold. There could be
Mhm.
another terrible thing that happens tomorrow, but I
Mhm.
know he was with me here. He was with me back there. He's going to be with me there. And
Mhm.
Yeah.
that is the really a deep peace
Mhm.
in the midst of vulnerability, in the midst of grief.
Mhm.
This is to me where the story of Job is so fabulous, because
Mhm.
the whole time he's having a conversation with God
Mhm.
because he believes that God is present. Like you're like,
Yes.
I'm angry with God because I believe he's present. There's a sense of like,
Exactly.
there's proof right there. God was with Job. Job was having this conversation with God. And then, of course,
Mm.
God makes himself obviously present with the
Mhm.
questions that he asked Job. But
Right.
at the end of the day, is this presence. That's what we have. And
Mhm.
there
Yeah.
we're strong, even
Yeah.
when
And
we
Absolutely.
I
feel
think
weak.
Mhm.
what you just said too is so true. And it's a great just reminder as we close out today, which is that, he never promised us an easy life. He
Mhm.
is a
Mm,
promise keeper. He is the
Mhm.
promise keeper. He keeps his word. And
Mhm.
all throughout scripture, we see how he keeps his promises and the promises that he makes to us, but never in scripture does he say, all of my people will be healed. All of my people
Mhm.
will live a grief-free life, right?
Right.
Like there is hardship, but I think
Mhm.
one thing he does always promise, and he always goes back to, and you see it over and over again in scripture, is that his son has come, his son has died for us and been resurrected so that we can live in right relationship with him no matter what. And that means
Mhm.
that no matter where we are, no matter what's happening, no matter how hard life is, God is there and we can
Mhm.
talk to him and we can pray to him and we can be in relationship with him no
Mhm.
matter what.
Mhm.
and he knows our
Absolutely.
pain. It says the Lord is close to the brokenhearted, right? And
Mhm.
Yeah.
so obviously my prayer for you, Caitlin, is during this season especially, is
Mhm.
that you really sense his presence and
Mhm.
his comforting. I love in Corinthians where it says, praise to the God of comfort. He's the one
Mhm.
who
Yeah.
comforts us in
Mhm.
all of our trouble. And so
Mhm.
that we can then comfort others. And I think this picture of his presence is where we will find comfort. I pray that for you as you are
Mhm.
right in the
Yeah.
midst of grief,
Mhm.
because we could have this conversation here, but then you're going to be out there doing your thing. You're going to have your moments alone, and we
Mhm.
can't be there for you, but I know God can.
Mhm.
And I pray that you would sense his presence and his healing presence especially. And for
Thank
anyone
you.
who's listening who might be dealing with a difficult season or a loss that maybe they thought I should be over this already. Maybe they can't see the situation like you have been able to get to with Joe, and they're
Mhm.
still deeply grieving,
Mhm.
that God is with them, even that they don't have to rush grief, that they can
Mhm.
trust God's
Yeah.
timing in it,
Amen.
and that
Absolutely.
God will comfort in that place too.
Absolutely.
Amen.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Caitlin, for sharing your story and for coming into this podcast today so vulnerably
Mm.
and
Yeah.
in the midst of a season of grief for you. Thank
Mhm.
you for showing our audience and us even just how it is
Yeah.
that you can live that out, how you can live out your faith in the midst of grief, and for teaching us along the way how you are walking out your journey of faith. For anyone who's listening today, please, we want to have a conversation with you. This is not just a conversation on this podcast, but it's a conversation with you as the listeners. So please send us an email at hello@inezfranklin.org. .com. There we go. Try that again. Send us an email at send us an email at hello@inezfranklin.com. We're so grateful for you as our listeners. And please know that if you're experiencing a grief or a loss, that you do not have to go through it alone. Please find yourself a community. Please be willing to reach out to a mentor or a counselor or a therapist, as well as send us an email and let us know what's going on in your life. Thank you so much, and we hope you have a great day.
Thanks, Kaitlin.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you for listening to Uncharted Podcast with Inez Franklin. Learn more about Inez at unchartedpod.com. Follow Inez's journey on Instagram at Inez Franklin. Sign up for our email list to receive direct access to online experiences and more. Thanks for listening, and join us again next time.